Greetings, Mr. Gleason. Quiet, Balder. Come in. Be comfortable. How do you do, Dr. Stevens? How do you do, Mr. Jones? This, said Gleason, indicating a figure trailing him, is Mr. Harkness, head of our legal staff. Ah, yes, indeed. There will be matters of contract to be discussed. Welcome to Freehold, Mr. Harkness. Thank you, Harkness said coldly. Will your attorneys be present? They are present. Waldo indicated a stereo screen. 2 figures shone in it. They bowed and murmured polite forms. This is most irregular, Harkness complained. Witnesses should be present in person. Things seen and heard by television are not evidence. Waldo drew his lips back. Do you wish to make an issue of it? Not at all, Gleason said hastily. Never mind, Charles. Harkness subsided. I won't waste your time, gentlemen, Waldo began. We are here in order that I may fulfill my contract with you. The terms are known. We will pass over them. He inserted his arms into his primary Waldo's. Lined up along the far wall, you will see a number of radiant power receptors, commonly called decobs. Dr. Stevens may, if he wishes, check their serial numbers. No need to. Very well. I shall start my local beamcaster, in order that we may check the efficiency of their operation. His Waldos were busy as he spoke. Then I shall activate the receptors one at a time. His hands pawed the air. A little pair of secondaries switched on the proper switches on the control board of the last set in line. This is an ordinary type, supplied to me by Dr. Stevens, which has never failed in operation. You may assure yourself that it is now operating in the normal manner, if you wish, Doctor. I can see that it is. We will call such a receptor a decob, and its operation normal. The small Waldos were busy again. Here we have a receptor which I choose to term a Schneider decob, because of certain treatments it has received. The antenna began to move, and its operation Schneider-type operation. Will you check it, Doctor? Okay. You fetched with you a receptor set which has failed, as you can see. Have you been able to make it function? No, I have not. Are you sure? Have you examined it carefully? Quite carefully. Stevens acknowledged sourly. He was beginning to be tired of Waldo's pompous flubdubbery. Very well. I will now proceed to make it operative. Waldo left his control ring, shoved himself over to the vicinity of the defective decob, and placed himself so that his body covered his exact actions from the sight of the others. He returned to the ring and used Waldo's to switch on the activating circuit of the decob. It immediately exhibited Schneider-type activity. This is my case, gentlemen, he announced. I have found out how to repair decobs which become spontaneously inoperative. I will undertake to apply the Schneider treatment to any receptors which you may bring to me. This is included in my fee. I will undertake to train others in how to apply the Schneider treatment. That is included in my fee, but I cannot guarantee that any particular man will profit by my instruction. Without going into technical details, I may say that the treatment is very difficult, much harder than it looks. I think that Dr. Stevens will confirm that. He smiled thinly. I believe that completes my agreement with you. Just a moment, Mr. Jones, put in Gleason. Is a decob foolproof once it has received the Schneider treatment? Quite, I guarantee it. They went into a huddle while Waldo waited, and at last Gleason spoke for them. These are not quite the results we had expected, Mr. Jones, but we agree that you have fulfilled your commission, with the understanding that you will Schneider treat any receptors brought to you and instruct others according to their ability to learn. That is correct. Your fee will be deposited to your account at once. Good. That is fully understood and agreed. I have completely and successfully performed your commission? Correct. Very well then. I have one more thing to show you, if you will be patient. A section of the wall folded back, a gigantic Waldo reached into the room beyond and drew forth a large apparatus, which resembled somewhat in general form an ordinary set of decobs, but which was considerably more complicated. Most of the complications were sheer decoration, but it would have taken a skilled engineer a long time to prove that fact. The machine did not contain one novel the machine did contain one novel feature, a built-in meter of a novel type, whereby it could be set to operate for a predetermined time and then destroyed itself, and a radio control whereby the time limit could be varied. Furthermore, the meter would destroy itself and the receptors if tampered with by any person not familiar with its design. It was Waldo's tentative answer to the problem of selling free and unlimited power. But of these matters he said nothing. Small Waldos had been busy attaching guys to the apparatus, and when they were through, he said, "This, gentlemen, is an instrument which I choose to call a Jones-Schneider de Cobb, and it is the reason why you will not be in business of selling power much longer." "So," said Gleason, "may I ask why?" "Because," he was told, "I can sell it more cheaply and conveniently and under circumstances you cannot hope to match." "That's a strong statement." "I will demonstrate. Dr. Stevens, you have noted that the other receptors are operating. I will turn them off." The Waldos did so. "I will now stop the beamcast, and I will ask you to assure yourself by means of your own instruments that there is no radiant power, other than ordinary visible light in the room." Somewhat sullenly, Stevens did so. "Place is dead," he announced some minutes later. "Good. Keep your instruments in place that you may be sure it remains dead. I will now activate my receptor. Little mechanical hands close the switches. Observe it, Doctor. Go over it thoroughly." Stevens did so. He did not trust the readings shown by its instrument board. He attached his own meters in parallel. "How about it, James?" Gleason whispered. Stevens looked disgusted. "The damn thing draws power from nowhere?" They all looked at Waldo. "Take plenty of time, gentlemen," he said grandly. "Talk it over." They withdrew as far away as the room permitted, and whispered. Waldo could see that Harkness and Gleason were arguing that Stevens was non-committal. That suited him. He was hoping that Stevens would not decide to take another look at the fancy gadget that he had termed a Jones-Schneider de Cobb. Stevens must not learn too much about it yet. He had been careful to say nothing but the truth about it, but perhaps he had not said all of the truth. He had not mentioned that all Schneider-treated de Cobbs were sources of free power. Rather embarrassing if Stevens should discover that. The meter and destruction device Waldo had purposely made mysterious and complex, but it was not useless. Later, he would be able to point out quite correctly that without such a device, Napa simply could not remain in business. Waldo was not easy. The whole business was a risky gamble. He would have much preferred to know more about the phenomena he was trying to peddle, but he shrugged mentally while preserving a smile of smug confidence. The business had dragged on several months already, and the power situation really was critical. This solution would do, if he could get their names on the dotted line quickly enough. For he had no intention of trying to compete with Napa. Gleason pulled himself away from Stevens and Harkness and came to Waldo. "Mr. Jones, can't we arrange this amicably? What have you to suggest?" It was quite an hour later that Waldo, with a sigh of relief, watched his guests shift apart from the threshold flat. A fine caper, he thought, and it had worked. He had gotten away with it. He had magnanimously allowed himself to be persuaded to consolidate, provided that he had allowed himself to be quite temperamental about this. The contract was concluded at once, no fussing around and fencing between lawyers. Now or never, put up or shut up. The proposed contract, he had pointed out virtuously, gave him nothing at all, unless his allegations about the Jones-Schneider de Cobb was correct. Gleason considered this point, and decided to sign, and had signed. Even then, Harkness had attempted to claim that Waldo had been an employee of Napa. Waldo had written that first contract himself, a specific commission for a contingent fee. Harkness did not have a leg to stand on. Even Gleason had to agree to that. In exchange for all rights to the Jones-Schneider de Cobb, for which he agreed to supply drawings, wait till Stevens saw and understood those sketches. For that, he had received the promise of senior stock in Napa, non-voting, but fully paid up and non-assessable. The lack of active participation in the company had been his own idea. There was going to be more headaches in the power business, headaches aplenty. He could see them coming. Bootleg designs, means of outwitting the metering, lots of things. Free power had come, and efforts to stop it would be in the long run, he believed, fruitless. Waldo laughed so hard that he frightened Baldur, who set up an excited bark. He could afford to forget Hathaway now. His revenge on Napa contained one potential flaw. He had assured Gleason that the Schneider-treated de Cobbs would continue to operate, would not come unstuck. He believed that to be true simply because he had faith in Gramp Schneider, but he was not prepared to prove it. He knew himself that he did not know enough about the phenomena associated with the other world to be sure that something would or would not happen. It was still going to be necessary to do some hard, extensive research, but the other world was a devilishly difficult place to investigate. Suppose he speculated that the human race were blind, had never developed eyes. No matter how civilized, enlightened, and scientific the race might have become, it is difficult to see how such a race could ever have developed the concepts of astronomy. They might know of the sun as a cyclic source of energy having a changing directional character, for the sun is so overpowering that it may be seen with the skin. They would notice it and invent instruments to trap it and examine it. But the pale stars, would they ever notice them? It seemed most unlikely. The very notion of the celestial universe, its silent depths and starlit grandeur, would be beyond them, even if one of their scientists should have the concept forced on him in such a manner that he was obliged to accept the fantastic, incredible thesis as fact. How, then, would he go about investigating its details? Waldo tried to imagine an astronomical phototelescope conceived and designed by a blind man, intended to be operated by a blind man, and capable of collecting data which could be interpreted by a blind man. He gave it up. There was too many hazards. It would take a subtlety of genius far beyond his own to deal with the inescapably tortuous concatenations of inferential reasoning necessary to the solution of such a problem. It would strain him to invent such instruments for a blind man. He did not see how a blind man could ever overcome the difficulties unassisted. In a way, that was what Schneider had done for him. Alone, he would have been bogged down. But even with Schneider's hints, the problems of investigating the other world was still much like the dilemma of the blind astronomer. He could not see the other world. Only through the Schneider treatment had he been able to contact it. Damnation! How could he design instruments to study it? He suspected that he would eventually have to go back to Schneider for further instruction, but that was an expedient so distasteful that he refused to think much about it. Furthermore, Graham Schneider might not be able to teach him much. They did not speak the same language. This much he did know. The other space was there, and it could be reached sometimes by proper orientation of the mind, deliberately as Schneider had taught him, or subconsciously, as had happened to MacLeod and others. He found the idea distasteful. That thought, and the thought alone, should be able to influence physical phenomena was contrary to the whole materialistic philosophy in which he had grown up. He had a prejudice in favor of order and invariably natural laws. His cultural predecessors, the experimental philosophers who had built up the world of science and its concomitant technology, Galileo, Newton, Edison, Einstein, Steinmetz, Jeans, and their myriad colleagues, these men had thought of the physical universe as a mechanism preceded by inexorable necessity. Any apparent failure to proceed thus was regarded as an error in observation, an insufficient formulation of hypothesis, or an insufficiency of datum. Even the short reign of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle had not changed the fundamental orientation toward order in cosmos. The Heisenberg uncertainty was one they were certain of. It could be formulated, expressed, and a rigorous statistical mechanics could be built from it. In 1958, Horowitz's reformulation of wave mechanics had eliminated the concept. Order and causation were restored, but this damned business, one might as well pray for rain, wish on the moon, go to faith healers, surrender whole hog to Bishop Berkeley's sweetly cerebral world in your head. The tree's not a tree when there's no one about the quad. Waldo was not emotionally wedded to absolute order as Rimbaud had been. He was in no danger of becoming mentally unbalanced through a failure of his basic conceptions. Nevertheless, consarnate, it was convenient for things to work the way one expected them to. On order and natural law was based predictability, and without predictability it was impossible to live. Clock should run evenly, water should boil when heat is applied to it, food should nourish, not poison, the Cobb receptors should work the way they were designed to. Chaos was insupportable. It could not be lived with. Suppose chaos were king, and the order we thought we detected in the world about us a mere phantasm of the imagination. Where would that lead us? In that case, Waldo decided it was entirely possible that a 10-pound weight did fall 10 times as fast as a 1-pound weight until the day the audacious Galileo decided in his mind that it was not so. Perhaps the whole meticulous science of ballistics, derived from the convictions of a few firm-minded individuals who had sold the notions to the world, perhaps the very stars were held firm in their courses by the unvarying faith of the astronomers. Orderly cosmos created out of chaos, by mind. The world was flat before geographers decided to think of it otherwise. The world was flat, and the sun, tub-size, rose in the east and set in the west. The stars were little lights, studding a pellucid dome which barely cleared the tallest mountains. Storms were the wrath of gods, and had nothing to do with the calculus of air masses. A mind-created animism dominated the world then. More recently it had been different. A prevalent convention of materialistic and invariable causation had ruled the world. On it was based the whole involved technology of machine-served civilization. The machines worked the way they were designed to work because everybody believed in them. Until a few pilots, somewhat debilitated by overmuch exposure to radiation, had lost their confidence and infected their machines with uncertainty, and thereby let magic loose in the world. He was beginning, he thought, to understand what had happened to magic. Magic was the erratic law of an animistic world. It had been steadily pushed back by the advancing philosophy of invariant causation. It was gone now until the new outbreak, and its world with it, except for backwaters of superstition. Naturally, an experimental scientist reported failure when investigating haunted houses, apparitions, and the like. His convictions prevented the phenomena from happening. The deep jungles of Africa might be very different places, when there was no white man around to see. The strange, slippery laws of magic might still obtain. Perhaps these speculations were too extreme. Nevertheless, they had one advantage which orthodox concepts had not. They included Graham Schneider's hexing of the decabs. Any working hypothesis which failed to account for Schneider's and his own ability to think a set of decabs into operation was not worth a continental. This one did, and it conformed to Graham's own statements. All matters are doubtful, and a thing can both be, not be, and be anything. There are many true ways of looking at the same thing. Some ways are good and some are bad. Very well, accept it. Act on it. The world varied according to the way one looked at it, and in that case, thought Waldo, he knew how he wanted to look at it. He cast his vote for order and predictability. He would set the style. He would impress his own concept of the other world on the cosmos. It had been a good start to assure Gleason that the Schneider-treated decabs were foolproof. Good. So let it be. They were foolproof. They would never get out of order. He proceeded to formulate and clarify his own concept of the other world in his mind. He would think of it as orderly and basically similar to this space. The connection between the two spaces lay in the neurological system. The cortex, the thalamus, the spinal cord, and the appended nerve system were closely connected with both spaces. Such a picture was consistent with that Schneider had told him, and did not conflict with phenomena as he knew it. Wait, if the neurological system lay in both spaces, then that might account for the relatively slow propagation of nerve impulse as compared with electromagnetic progression. Yes, if the other space had a C constant relatively smaller than that of this space, such would follow. He began to feel a small, calm assurance that it was so. Was he merely speculating or creating a universe? Perhaps he would have to abandon his mental picture of the other space as being the size and shape of an ostrich egg, since a space with a slower propagation of light is not smaller but larger than the space he was used to. No, wait a second. The size of a space did not depend on its C constant, but on its radius of curvature in terms of C constant. And since C was a velocity, size was dependent on the notion of time, and in this case, time and entropy rate. Therein lie a characteristic which could be compared between the two spaces. They exchanged energy, they affected each other's entropy. The one which degenerated the more rapidly towards a state of level entropy was the smaller. He need not abandon his picture of the ostrich egg. Good old egg. The other world was a closed space with a slow C, a high entropy rate, a short radius, and an entropy state near level, a perfect reservoir of power at every point, ready to spill over into this space, wherever he might close the interval. To its inhabitants, if any, It might seem to be hundreds of millions of light years around. To him, it was an ostrich egg, turgid to bursting with power. He was already beginning to think of ways of checking his hypothesis. If, using a Schneider-de-Cobb, he were to draw energy at the highest rate he could manage, would he affect the local potential? Would it establish an entropy gradient? Could he reverse the process by finding a way to pump power into the other world? Could he establish different levels at different points and thereby check for degeneration toward level, maximum entropy? Did the speed of nerve impulse propagation furnish a clue to the sea of the other space? Could such a clue be combined with the entropy and potential investigations to give a mathematical picture of the other space in terms of its constants and its age? He set about it. His untrammeled, wild speculations had produced some definite good. He tied down at least one line of attack on that other space. He devised a working principle for his blind man's telescope mechanism. Whatever the truth of the thing was, it was more than a truth. It was a complete series of new truths. It was the very complexity of that series of new truths, the characteristic laws that were inherent properties of the other space, plus the new truth laws resulted from the interaction of the characteristic of the other space with normal space. No wonder Rambaud had said anything could happen. Almost anything could, in all probability, by proper application and combination of the three sets of new laws: the laws of our space, the laws of other space, and the coordinate laws of both spaces. But before theoreticians could begin work, new data were most desperately needed. Waldo was no theoretician, a fact he admitted left-handedly in thinking of theory as impractical and unnecessary, time waste for him as a consulting engineer. Let the smooth apes work it out. But the consulting engineer had to find out one thing. Would the Schneider-de-Cobbs continue to function uninterrupted as guaranteed? If not, what must be done to assure continuous function? The most difficult and the most interesting aspect of the investigation had to do with the neurological system in relation to other space. Neither electromagnetic instruments nor neurosurgery was refined enough to do accurate work on the level he wished to investigate. But he had Waldos. The smallest Waldos he had used up to this time were approximately half an inch across their palms, with microscanners to match, of course. They were much too gross for his purpose. He wished to manipulate living nerve tissue, examine its insulation and its performance in situ. He used the tiny Waldos to create tinier ones. The last stage was tiny metal blossoms hardly an eighth of an inch across. The helices in their stems or forearms, which served them as pseudomuscles, could hardly be seen by the naked eye, but then he used scanners. His final team of Waldos used for nerve and brain surgery varied in succeeding stages from mechanical hands nearly life-size down to these fairy digits which could manipulate things much too small for the eye to see. They were mounted and banked to work in the same locus. Waldo controlled them all from the same primaries. He could switch from one size to another without removing his gauntlets. The same change in circuits which brought another size of Waldos under control automatically accomplished the change in sweep of scanning to increase or decrease the magnification, so that Waldo always saw before him in his stereo receiver a life-size image of his other hands.